Hello and welcome. My name is Marie Svoboda, and I'm a conservator of antiquities at the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles, California, home of the Getty's collection of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. Today's program is part of the Getty's Art Break series. We take inspiration from objects in the Getty's collection and from special exhibitions to encourage new conversations about ancient cultures. Today, we will be uncovering color in ancient Assyrian sculpture. And I'm pleased to welcome Shiyanthi Thavapalan, who will be joining me in discussions about color. Shiyanthi, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Marie. I'm an assistant professor in Assyriology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I research and teach the ancient history as well as the ancient, the dead languages written in cuneiform script of what is basically Iraq and parts of Syria today.
Shiyanthi and I are here today to talk about color on ancient works of art and its presence, or mostly lack of presence, on art today. An example of this is the Assyrian relief shown on the screen right now, which would have been once brightly colored in antiquity, but of which only traces exist today. This discussion was prompted by the exhibition here at the Getty Villa called Assyria, Palace Art of Ancient Iraq, on loan from the British Museum, and it closes very soon on September 5th. This exhibition, and especially the search for missing color on these reliefs, is a great example of how historians, conservators, and scientists work together to produce new knowledge about the ancient world, and we share them with the public like you. So Shiyanthi, can you get us started and tell us a bit about Assyrian sculpture?
Yeah, sure. So I think most people are familiar with these really exquisitely carved Assyrian reliefs that are on display at the Metropolitan Museum, at the British Museum, at the Louvre, and many, many other collections around the world. These are stone wall panels, and they're examples, like the example that you see on this slide and the previous slide, date from around the 10th to the 7th century BCE, and they come from northern Mesopotamia, so around the region of Mosul in modern Iraq. In ancient times, these panels were attached to the walls of massive palaces built by the great kings of Assyria. These palaces were spectacularly beautiful. The exteriors, the outsides were decorated with sort of panorama-like glazed brick facades, depicting all kinds of things, religious scenes, military scenes. And on the slide here, you see two examples, two lonely bricks of the kind of big panorama scene, glazed brick facades. And on one, you see a kind of ornamental design, and the other, you see a part of an ibex, a kind of wild goat. You can also see to the top left, small pieces of glass inlays. Now, these glass pieces would have been attached to things like furniture, but also large-scale sculpture. And so, yeah, even furniture had these wonderful elements of color and light. And when we move to the next slide, you'll see beautiful ivory inlays. And probably when most people think of ivories, they think of these pure white material. But here, the Assyrians stained their ivories and made them beautifully colored. And on the right side, you see also how ivory was sometimes covered with gold foil, gold leaf. Here you see a reconstruction from the mid-19th century of the interior of an Assyrian palace. Above, starting from about like 3 or 4 meters from the floor, floor level, you see painted murals. The ceilings wall also painted, and then you had these monumental bull and stone and lion colossi with these human heads guarding the doorways and the gateways. But really, the main decorative feature inside were these intricately carved reliefs, and they also depicted many, many things. In some, there are winged figures performing rituals. In others, the king is shown hunting, fighting lions, besieging distant lands, directing his people as they built palaces and canals and aqueducts. And there are also more personal scenes, for instance, enjoying a glass of wine with his wife. But what's fascinating about these reliefs is that contrary to what we can see today, if you remember that first slide, these reliefs were once completely and brilliantly colored, but hardly any of this polychromy, paint, gilding, or any of these inlays can be seen with the naked eye today. It is actually really hard to believe the excavator of these objects when they were first recovered from Iraq, when he wrote that there were traces of color found on nearly all of the reliefs. Now, one of Marie's specializations as a conservator is to investigate why this is and to develop techniques to discover any remnants of color that might still be there. Marie, can you tell us a little bit about why there's so little paint preserved on these reliefs?
Well, yeah, with the passage of time, as you were describing the environment, weathering, and burial, the conditions in which these were found, but also through post-excavation treatments. So when these reliefs and sculptures were excavated, they were cleaned, molds were made of them, impressions made of them. And so most of the colorful paint that was once covering the surfaces has been lost. So for example, I show this relief again from the British Museum, where very minute traces of red color can be seen where the arrows are pointing on the surface. Mm-hmm. And some reliefs still have a little more traces of color on the surface that can be seen with the naked eye. And I show an example here in the detail on the right. But in most cases, color is very, very difficult to identify because only minute particles still exist on the surface. So additionally, while some paint may be ancient, there are incidents of modern paint on the surface that have accidentally splattered or transferred over the years. And so those can be mistaken for ancient. And this adds a layer of complexity when one starts investigating the surface and looking for what is truly ancient color. But through technology and analysis, we can dive a little deeper into this, and we can begin to identify the real presence of ancient color, how these were intended to look and seen in the past. So of course, it would really help if we had ancient descriptions of what these reliefs were meant to look like, or how the ancient Assyrians perceived color. So if we only knew why they choose specific colors and how they use them, we'd have a much better understanding of what we would be looking for today. So we don't have much evidence of that, do we, Shiyanthi?
Yes and no. So, as you know, color isn't really in light or in objects. The seeing part of color is done with your eyes and in your brain, basically. So how we see color today is the same as how the Assyrians saw color thousands of years ago. But what's different is how our minds perceive color as a sensory experience, which aspects we choose to pay attention to, and how we choose to record these experiences through words and through art. So because Assyrians spoke Akkadian, and because they did so in a different cultural setting than we are today, they talked about and understood color fundamentally differently than we do. So I'm going to try and give you an example. So Marie, you can see these three colored circles in front of you. If I asked you to categorize these colors into two groups, how would you do it?
Well, I would divide them between blue and green, put the blues together and the greens separately in a separate category.
Yeah, that's right. I think most of us who speak English would do this because that's because we live in a culture and speak a language that prioritizes hue as the most important element of color. So whether something is green or blue or red matters more than whether it's light blue or dark blue, for instance. But if you speak a language that prioritizes brightness, let's say, over hue as the defining element of color, then you might choose to put the two lighter colors together because you think they're more alike, and the darker blue separately because you think it's it's more akin to black or something like that. In ancient Mesopotamia, colors were experienced through real world materials. So the materiality of colorful stuff, like these stones and metals, this wonderful amber, carnelian, amethyst, and so on, their shininess, the patterns on the surfaces, the textures, and even things like smell shaped people's ideas about colors themselves. So for example, this dark blue lapis lazuli that you see on the slide was associated with ideas like exotic, rare, royal, lustrous. So to answer your question, Marie, we do have descriptions of what Assyrian palaces look like, but the Assyrian way of talking about color is different than what we might expect. So instead of saying that the reliefs were painted red and yellow and green, the Assyrians talked about color as a kind of brilliant light that lit up the insides of the palaces. So I chose this kind of description of a palace by the king, or the emperor rather, the Assyrian emperor Esarhaddon, who reigned in the 7th century BCE. He writes, all around the perimeter of that palace, he's talking about his own palace here, I had the cornice and the coping made of obsidian and lapis lazuli colored brick. I encircled them around it like a wreath. I surrounded all the gates with an arch and a vault like a rainbow. I drove into them pegs of shining silver and bright bronze. So as an ancient historian, I try and link these kinds of written sources with the archaeological evidence. But as Marie said, the objects that we see them as we see them today are not very well preserved. So I work together with conservators as well so that we can pool our knowledge together and understand the meaning of these objects. Through many years of working with these kind of fragile ancient objects, Marie, as I understand it, has been following various methodologies for finding colors, and maybe she could tell us a little bit about them.
Sure. Well, conservators and conservation scientists, approach the investigation of color using various tools, and we have many things at our disposal, mostly through non-destructive scientific methods. And non-destructive means that we don't need to take a sample from the object. We can do it without disturbing the surface. So, however, the first step in exploring pigments and artifacts is to really understand what materials were available in antiquity. Right. So this slide here shows examples of the minerals, dyes, and artificially produced colors that would have been used to make pigments. In Assyria, depending on the period in which this relief or the sculpture was made, the most common colors that have been identified to date are listed on the left here. And those are colors that were used to produce blues, reds, black, yellows, and white. So with this knowledge, the conservators and the scientists can begin exploring the surface of artifacts using various technical tools. And one of them is, as you see on the screen here, broadband spectral imaging. This method allows the first steps in characterizing the possible materials that are present on the surface. And these examples here show a diagnostic response of some materials on the surface to the electromagnetic spectrum. So by simply taking a photograph and using these lighting conditions, on your right is ultraviolet light, the luminescent responses of certain materials and colors and decorations suddenly become visible and can be seen to the naked eye and are revealed and give us so much information.
Can you tell us a little bit about the methods that can help you actually locate the color on an object? And then how do you go about finding out the identity, let's say, of a particular colorful material, like the composition of paint, for example?
Sure, yeah. So advances in non-destructive technology over the past 20 years have made this possible. It's been truly amazing what we can do today. Mm-hmm. Digital magnification allows us to locate very tiny spots of pigment on the surface of artifacts. So in this example here on your right, you see a minute, very tiny spot of blue pigment with gilding on it, with gold, traces of gold. And this was found on the decorative headband on the marble sculpture seen on the left. Once we locate these spots, or we are looking for the color on the surface of objects, we use analytical or scientific instrumentation such as portable X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, which you can see in the slide on your left, where specific elements like copper or iron can be identified, and this provides clues to what the pigment may be. We also use fiber optics reflectance spectroscopy, and that's seen in the slide on your right, where a conservation scientist is using this instrument to identify very tiny particles of color on the surface of this marble sculpture at the Getty. So we use both of these techniques together in tandem so that we can better understand what materials were used. And this provides valuable information for how the artworks were meant to be seen.
I see. So why is it though that some pigments are easier to identify than others?
Well, that's a very good question, because some ancient pigments, such as the artificially produced Egyptian blue, have a diagnostic response to visible light, causing it to luminesce in the infrared spectrum. So you can see that in this example here from the Getty. Capturing this feature using a camera, we can enable the preliminary identification, which then typically is confirmed by secondary methods, the analytical tools I showed earlier. And through that way, we can actually identify what the pigment is. While I was not able to identify Egyptian blue on the Assyrian reliefs on loan from the British Museum, I'm showing you an example here on the right of what we would expect to see using this technique, and how the presence of Egyptian blue on this object can be detected through the luminescence of this pigment. So by interpreting color and what it symbolizes in tandem with the technical studies that we can do today, we can begin to better understand how these artworks once looked. So the methods for exploring color has also provided a new opportunity to develop suggestive recreations of ancient art. And with these modern presentations of how art would have once looked, this is mostly speculative because we don't always have all the information. But since the pigments are too small, the traces are very tiny, and maybe the colors have altered over time, but still, identifying these colors and finding them on the surface of artifacts gives us information that sheds new light on how things were presented and looked in the ancient world. So Shiyanthi, speaking of recreations and color, how we show what color looks like in antiquity, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts on it? And how do you think that this informs the public?
Well, I think reconstructions are a very important and widely used process for building knowledge in the sciences, in the humanities, in the arts. Really, it's a much larger phenomena. It's a way really to bridge theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge about a certain subject. And because of their strong visual appeal, reconstructions are very effective in engaging the public. But when we go to a museum and actually look at a reconstruction, we should keep in mind the complexities and the various methods involved in producing them. So for example, when a paleontologist puts together a reconstruction of a dinosaur, at its core, this is based on the evidence of skeletal and fossil remains. But rarely do we ever find the bones of an entire dinosaur in one site. So scientists complete their models using evidence from specimens found elsewhere, and also through educated guesses. So the flesh, muscles, diet, and even behavior of extinct animals are often reconstructed by comparing them to similar features in living animals. So when it comes to color reconstructions of the Assyrian reliefs, we should also keep in mind that they could have many different purposes. Sometimes all they're meant to do is to provide an impression of what an ancient reality may have been, or to force you, the audience, when you visit the museum, to confront your own preconceptions about what ancient artifacts should look like. For example, I made this digital reconstruction for my students to give them an impression of what these reliefs would have looked like in the flickering of firelight, because these palaces didn't have light wells or windows, and these brilliantly colored reliefs would have only been visible through soft, moving light. And this, of course, changes the aesthetic experience of color. Other reconstructions are produced based on, with comparisons of wall paintings and the kind of glazed murals I was talking about before from the same period. And these try and reproduce ancient coloring techniques, and that can teach us a lot about how ancient sculptors and painters worked, what kind of pigments they used, how the pigments react to the kind of binders that were available to them, and how paint was applied on the surface to create different kinds of painterly effects. But in polychromic studies, yes, there's such a thing called polychromic studies, there's a tension between, let's say, a more cautious approach, emphasizing the knowledge that we don't have, and a more experimental point of view, emphasizing what we do know and extrapolating from there. A good reconstruction will make clear which aspects are based on historical, archaeological, and scientific evidence, and which are based on educated guesses or are more speculative. But, just like when a historian writes a book, or when a paleontologist creates that model of the T-Rex, a reconstruction creates a tradition of how we think something happened in the past. And I think it's the task of museums like the Getty to help people contextualize this tradition, to mediate between people who visit the museums and scholars who produce knowledge based on the available evidence and based on methodologies and theories that can maybe help fill some of the gaps. But I think, Marie, you are an advocate of a more cautious approach when it comes to making polychrome reconstructions. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right. And this is mainly because, if you locate a tiny particle of color on the surface of something that would have once been fully colored, for example, say if you find a tiny particle of blue, it doesn't mean that the whole surface or that area was painted blue. It could have been that the blue was mixed with yellow to make green. The blue was mixed with red to make purple. It was mixed in with white pigment to make the color more brilliant or cooler in appearance, or it could have been part of a detail or a highlight on the surface. So we just don't know. It's very difficult to make these choices just based on this small amount of evidence. And this particle of blue does not tell the whole story, right? But the discovery of this particle of color does reveal something very important. It shows us that there was color present, and that most likely the way this was presented in antiquity had color on most of the surface, was very colorful, and had an intended purpose and design for people to enjoy and appreciate. So we can see examples of amazingly preserved color still present on ancient artifacts. And so this kind of helps guide us in some of our, as you suggested, Shiyanthi, in our recreations, we're building it based on some knowledge of what color looked like in antiquity. And I show this example of the very well-known bust of Nefertiti. It's a limestone sculpture with polychromy on it. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it and the amazing color on the surface. And here are a few examples from the Getty collection that show the very bright, brilliant, bold colors that remain from antiquity on the surface. On the left, you can see a wall painting with mineral pigments and dyes. You can see on a wall painting in the center, you see a Romano-Egyptian mummy portrait that is a painted panel with brilliant colors and the use of gold leaf to create shimmering and light effects. And on the right, a pelicky with traces of pigment and gold as well on the surface that all have, still survived from antiquity. So we take these color recreations based on some of this information, and even ones that have no color remaining on the surface, although still speculative when we recreate them, we still can have an opportunity to reach the public and show them how these artifacts were once decorated and very colorful. And this is information that we only recently have come to know, that this has only recently become a well-known fact in understanding ancient art. So amazing stuff.
Yeah, well, there you are, folks. Lots of questions, lots of debate, and we are still looking for answers. But maybe that's a good point to wrap up on this optimistic note and let our listeners ask some questions. I see a couple of questions here, so I'm just going to go into the Q&A and see what we have. Let's see. Okay, so Laura is asking, the Met in NYC is doing something similar with ancient Greek and Roman statuary. The results from a private company with museum oversight are startling. Is this a new trend in museum shows? Do you want to talk about that, or should I, Marie? Or
well, maybe we can both talk about it a little
yeah.
bit. I definitely see a huge, well, it has been a topic of conversation for a very long time, and we have scholars who have been producing recreations for a long time, just to convey to the public how a lot of art is misinterpreted by seeing it as stark and white. And especially when you're in a museum, when you're looking at art, if you don't have this knowledge, it limits your appreciation and perspective about the works of art. So I do see a larger trend. There's a lot of discussions and recreations and conferences and publications on color of ancient art. And again, it's an approach that's very challenging to deal with, because we don't always have all the information. So it's hopeful that we can convey that what people are looking at is just an idea, and that we're trying to express what would have possibly once existed on the surfaces, but without wanting to be held accountable for exactly how it was meant to look, because again, we'll never know. Without a time machine, we'll never know exactly how they looked, right?
Yeah, I actually read a review in the Washington Post about the exhibition. It was very positive, but the reviewer, I don't remember his name anymore, also the journalist also said that difficult was the word he used too, because he found himself being confronted by these, as you say, Laura, startling reconstructions. And he wrote something along the lines of, it's okay if you don't like it, but it's great when you are confronted with it, because then you all become aware of all of the ideas that you also had about what these things should look like, or what they've been presented to you in the past as they should look like. And then you always learn something. It is becoming more and more common in museums to have polychromic exhibitions, definitely. Do you want to take the next question, Marie?
Sure. Well, I see a couple of questions here, and one asking how Egyptian blue pigment was produced, which is, blue was a very rare color in antiquity, and so it was very difficult to find sources of blue. Some of the blue minerals, such as lapis lazuli, which is ground and used as a pigment, was a very precious and rare material, so it wasn't always available. And yet blue was a color that represented so many symbolic and important things that it was a very desirable color. So in antiquity, they were able to produce the blue color by taking various ingredients, including copper and salts and silicates, and they heated it together to produce a brick of blue, almost like a blue glass, that then could be ground and used as a pigment. And so this was a technology that was probably first exploited in Egypt, but was used throughout the Mesopotamian, Near Eastern region, and throughout Italy in the ancient times. And so it became a very accessible pigment because it could be manufactured, produced, and used for painting to produce beautiful blue colors. And I see the next question is kind of related to the Getty, and why don't I quickly answer that one?
Yeah,
just because
don't even quickly, take your time.
yeah. Well, somebody is interested in, the work that we're doing for studying color in the collection. And so we're a very busy institution with installations and shows and displays and doing lots of various different types of projects, but we do try to set aside time to be able to study the collection and understand what we have and look for color on artifacts. So this is an initiative that we have that we're slowly tackling little by little. Working with scholars, working with various different people, using the technology at hand, working with our partners at the Getty Conservation Institute for identifying materials and using instrumentation for understanding what we have on artifacts within the collection. We also do lots of collaborations with outside institutions when they loan objects to the Getty. We offer to study and do technical studies of artworks. So little by little, we're tackling this massive subject and we're publishing little by little. So we hope that eventually we'll be able to have a better understanding of everything in our collection and what would have had ancient color on the surface. And if you just stay connected with the Getty, you'll see what our results are as we move forward. So.
I have a question here by Molly. She wants to know what the next big questions are in polychromic studies, the next big steps moving forward in the coming years. And I personally think one of the exciting kind of current trends in polychromic studies is looking at metal sculpture, the colors of bronze sculpture, for instance. Now, you might think, what, colors on bronze sculpture? Yeah, they were colored. They were not just the monochrome, sort of this reddish bronze color. No, the ancient craftsmen also used various kinds of surface treatments to manipulate the colors, just as an example, to change the red to more greenish tones or darker reddish tones or more yellowish tones and so on, to create certain effects. And unfortunately, we don't have many examples of bronze sculpture from the ancient world, either from the Mediterranean world or from the ancient Near East, because metal was recycled. So we don't have these anymore. What we have are the copies in stone, usually. So but we do have smaller scale figurines, for instance, from Mesopotamia or especially from the Hittite region, which is what's basically modern Turkey. And there are some really interesting studies being done on the colors of metals, especially alloying. There was a lot of technological advances in alloying that happened in the late Bronze Age and in the Iron Age. That's when the Iron Age is really when the period we're talking about with the Assyrian reliefs. They sort of invented new alloys. I was just reading an article by a colleague who was talking about how they were alloying cuprite nickel or something in order to imitate the colors of silver. So they were creating all kinds of new metal colors, and it's just a pity that we don't have the physical evidence for this, but no one has really taken the time to really dig into the textual evidence for this. So I think that's a really kind of cool trend moving forward. Marie?
Yeah, I just want to add really quickly that, in addition to manipulating the actual metal work, they used inlays, and we have evidence of copper inlays in the nipples and lips. We have evidence of surface patination, where they were able to change the color of the surface based on chemicals that they applied and heated the surface. A lot of marble sculptures had, inlaid glass eyes or ivory details. And there's some really amazing examples like the Riace bronzes, which are large scale and have survived, or the Roman wrestler who has even evidence of blood splatter on his face and bruises under his skin, which they were able to produce in bronze. So there are some amazing examples, not enough examples to really kind of help us understand how they did a lot of this ancient bronze work, but I think there's many scholars out there that are studying and focused on that subject. So I'm sure we'll see more in the coming years. I see a question here that might be perfect for you, Shiyanthi, that the thoughts on the symbology of Assyrian work, on the color of Assyrian work.
Oh yeah, well, symbolism is a really difficult question to answer because, colors don't exist in a vacuum, right? They exist on materials, on objects that are being used by people in certain contexts like ceremonies or rituals or whatever. You connect the object with color to other objects. So when you think about symbolism, really you have to think about kind of a mesh of various kinds of signs working together to produce meaning. So it's really difficult to say, well, red symbolized this or blue symbolized this or so on, because first of all, as I said before, their concepts of color was slightly different from ours. So the way they built meaning around their colors was different. So that in mind, I can tell you that blue, especially this kind of deep blue associated with lapis lazuli, this deep kind of lustrous blue, almost with hints of darkness to it, and also crimson, which they created with on their textiles with kermes dye and combining madder with certain other things in order to produce this really rich red, and also deep red paints and so on. So red and blue were really important to them. So it was important because they were associated with royalty and also divine light. So a lot of the statues of the gods, for instance, were made with reddish gold. It's often said because this was sort of the most prestigious kind of gold that has a high kind of copper content, so that it has this reddish sheen in it. And they often were given textiles, garments that were made of these reds and blue colors. But of course, light and dark were also very important colors, but they were not necessarily, it's not all very simple. So you can't say, well, black was a bad color and white was good, because black was associated with darkness and white with lightness and so on. It's much more complex, and really, when one thinks of color symbolism, one has to think, again, as I said, in the ways that things are bundled together, how signs are bundled together. I hope that answered the question.
That sounds great. Yeah.
So
I see one here that actually just addresses the fact of doing color recreations and the potential issue of the nuances that would have been, attempted in, ancient polychromy. And, again, I tried to emphasize that we will never know exactly how things were meant to look in antiquity, and you need to think about the subtleties of the types of paints and binding materials that they used on surfaces, what type of surfaces, if they were dark or luminescent marble, and whether there were attempts to create shading or light washes versus thick applications of paint. There are many nuances that it will be really impossible to fully understand in most instances. And because object by object and culture by culture and material by material, it's can vary immensely. So I do approach recreations very cautiously. Because there's such a desire and kind of appeal to show objects with color on them. This is why it's important to mention that the results, the information that we have, whether it's scientific or symbolic or whether we, understand how something was meant to look, is very speculative. And again, it's not meant to show the correct view or how something once looked, but just to get people thinking about that things had color on them. And that's why, again, it's really important how you present this information so that somebody doesn't, you know, take it as fact, and how that this or like everything like it looked that way in antiquity. These are all just suggestive, and they're intended to get people thinking. And, you know, I hope the more we can have dialogues about it, and the more we can explain this as we present this information, the more people will understand that going forward.
Yeah, I would emphasize that last part. Like, I don't, you know, as I said when I discussed this, all fields of knowledge, whether it's the sciences or the humanities, use reconstructions. It is a methodology, and as Marie said, the main point is that they create discourse, and discourse moves us forward. Hopefully, unless we're getting bogged down on the wrong things. So yeah, I don't think they do a disservice. No, as long as they are contextualized and all the things that Marie said, they really do advance our knowledge, I think. Yeah, I think our time's up. Isn't it, Marie? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're winding down right now. So yeah, this might be a good point to conclude our session. I know that there's a lot of questions still to be answered, but hopefully through the resources that everybody can see right now on the screen and through the chat, that will be helpful for taking this conversation forward and being able to read and understand more about ancient color on everything, really, and not just Assyrian reliefs. I really want to thank you, Shiyanthi, for your discussion, your expertise, your thoughtful responses, for working with me on this. It's been it's been a real pleasure. And I want to thank all the viewers out there for watching and for submitting all of these very thoughtful questions. I want to say also that make sure you stay connected to getty.edu for any future information and future programs, future art breaks. And that's it. I want to thank everybody. And
yes. Thank you very much from my side as well. And yeah, if you have any questions, I think you have my email is posted somewhere. So you can always email me.
Wonderful.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.